All right. So thanks everybody for joining us today. It is our pleasure to have Jan Bernstein and Claire Wybert of Bernstein Associates to lead us in today's presentation. So I am going to hand it over to them. Thank you so much for leading today's conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jan Bernstein.
And I'm Claire Wilbert.
Lovely to be here with you today. Thank you so much to the New England Museum Association for offering this training. We really appreciate the opportunity. And while I know you said that maybe not having your video on would be a good thing for some folks, we highly encourage you to keep your video on if you're comfortable doing that. We'd love to see your lovely faces. Today, we are doing the first of a two-part workshop. And today we are going to provide you with an overview of NAGPRA. We're going to walk you through various needs assessments based on different types of museums. And then we are going to demonstrate how to plan strategically based on various results of a needs assessment. And then we are going to assign you homework for the following week. Claire, do you want to talk about what we're going to do during part two?
Absolutely. And so part two next week, when we come back together and you've all completed your homework, we're actually going to ditch the PowerPoint and have a roundtable discussion. We're going to ask all of you to share what you came up with over the week in between these two sessions, and we'll answer whatever questions you might have and help you come up with some actionable next steps to implement your strategic plan or finish your needs assessment or whatever will help you move forward.
Thank you, Claire. So here we are in part one. This is a bird's eye view of NAGPRA. On the left is NAGPRA's discovery provision. On the right is NAGPRA's collections provisions. As you can see, there's a dotted line between the discovery provision and the collections provision. It's a semi-impenetrable wall that exists. And so if you have ever read NAGPRA's, the law and the implementing regulations, you'll see that it's broken up into distinct parts. And they should be read as separate parts. I discourage you from diving into a particular paragraph that maybe contains a word that you've searched on, but always read the law and the regs from the top of a section down to the bottom, and rather than diving in to the middle of a section, because there are distinct differences between discovery and collections. For example, discovery provision applies to discoveries of Native American human remains or cultural items made on tribal land or federal land after the passage of NAGPRA, after November 16th, 1990, whereas the collections provisions of NAGPRA apply to Native American human remains and cultural items in the control or possession of a museum or federal agency, no matter when they were acquired. And so the collections provisions include an inventory provision, a summary provision, repatriation provision, disposition provision. There is criminal enforcement in both sections, discovery and collections, but civil penalties only apply to the collections provision, and civil penalties only apply to museums. There's also a review committee that has purview over certain aspects of the collections provision, and there are grants that are available for collections provision activities. So this is actually a funded mandate. And this past year, there was more money available for grants than ever before, about $3.5 million in grant funds.
All right, and so if we dive in a little deeper from that overview, you can see we've highlighted the collections provisions section in yellow because our assumption is that as members of the New England Museum Association, you are most likely most interested in the collections provisions. And so we've called out here sort of some high level details that you should sort of be familiar with as you move through the process of complying with the collections provisions. And so the first thing to think about is who has standing under the law. And it is lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations. The covered types of items under the law are Native American human remains, which when we're talking about them in the context of sort of the legal language, we will use the term human remains because that's the way it's described in the law and the regs. But generally, we try to refer to these people as individuals or ancestors and be mindful of sort of the language that your tribal partners prefer and recognize that there is a distinction between how we refer to these people legally and then just sort of in the broader scope of this work. And then also funerary objects. There are associated funerary objects and unassociated funerary objects, and we'll get into that distinction a little later. Sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. The institutions that must comply with the law are federal agencies, with the exception of the Smithsonian, because they have their own law, and then museums. And under NAGPRA, museums are defined a little more broadly than sort of the general public would think of museums. And to be a museum under NAGPRA, you must receive federal funding directly or indirectly and have control of Native American human remains or cultural items. So museums could be sort of the general public's concept of a museum, but also libraries, municipalities, universities. Sorry, I have a dog with a toy here. You know, anyone who meets those two criteria. And then we also wanted to give a quick overview of the processes that are involved in compliance. If you are undertaking summary provision compliance, you develop your summary, you invite consultation and consult, which could lead to the publication of a notice of intent to repatriate and then repatriation. And if you are complying with the inventory provision, you consult as you develop that inventory, ideally with the tribes who may have an interest. You finalize that inventory and submit it and a draft notice of inventory completion for publication, the notice for publication in the Federal Register. Once that's published, you can offer repatriation of culturally affiliated ancestors and associated funerary objects, or disposition of unassociated human remains and associated funerary objects after a 30-day waiting period is passed. So I know that was a lot, but just wanted to at least get you all thinking in sort of these key terms.
So there are 9 ways that a museum might fail to comply with NAGPRA. And they're listed here. There is no NAGPRA police force out there. looking for non-compliance, and the National NAGPRA program does not look for non-compliant museums. The National NAGPRA program is actually there as a resource to help you, even if you find yourself in a situation where you are in one or more of these non-compliant situations. It takes an allegation of non-compliance for an investigation to ensue. And anyone may make an allegation of non-compliance, and they could list any or all of these different ways that the museum they're alleging is in non-compliance, has failed to comply. And that goes to the National NAGPRA program. And then their investigator will basically pick up the phone and call and say, do you receive federal funds? And do you have in your control or possession Native American human remains or cultural items? And by cultural items, they mean sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, funerary objects. And the broader definition of the term in NAGPRA is actually human remains as well. If you answer yes to both questions, you receive federal funds and have control or possession of Native American human remains or cultural items, then they will move forward with the investigation. And once you are found to have failed to comply, then the Secretary of the Interior will levy fines. And currently the fines are set at $7,000. They go up with inflation periodically. It's either $7,000 or 0.25% of your museum's annual budget. And it's usually assessed not against the museum, but against the parent organization's budget. But it's whichever is less. So typically it is the $7,000 amount that is the basic fine. And then additional fines can be levied on a per day, per violation basis, so long as that violation isn't rectified. On the right side of this slide, you can see some statistics compiled by Tim McEwen, who wrote the original regs, is on the review committee right now. He follows this as closely as he can through FOIA requests. And less than $60,000 in fines have been collected since NAGPRA was implemented. So what I take away from this is people are very loath to, very reluctant to make allegations of non-compliance. Most allegations are made by employees, former employees, and students. It's very, very rare that a tribe makes an allegation of non-compliance, and I've heard from the tribes that they hesitate to do it until they have no more options because they would rather work with the institution than have them have to deal with an investigation. So we are on to the needs assessment portion of today's training. And first we'll talk about the inventory provision. And the inventory provision lays out a process for the repatriation of Native American human remains and associated funerary objects. And those would be culturally affiliated when it's repatriation, and it lays out a process for the disposition of culturally unidentifiable human remains with a strong recommendation to disposition the associated funerary objects. So Claire, you're representing a museum today. Maybe you're representing multiple museums today. You're in a situation, I believe, that you maybe have some ancestors and associated funerary objects in your control or possession. Is that right?
That is very true. At this moment, I am a museum that way back before the original deadline, we did submit our culturally unidentifiable inventories. And we just said that everyone under our control is culturally identifiable. And I just joined the staff a couple of years ago and decided to look back at what we'd done, make sure that we were in compliance with NAGPRA. And, I realized that based on the information that I saw, we could probably culturally affiliate a lot of the ancestors under our control. And that's where I am right now. And I don't really know how to move forward at this point.
So it sounds like you turned in your if I'm hearing you correctly, you turned in your cultural and identifiable inventory before or on that November 16th, 1995 deadline. That was actually the deadline for making your cultural affiliation determination. And then you had 6 months to submit your inventory, and you did that. But consultation was lacking. And now you want to reinvigorate consultation because you believe there is evidence of cultural affiliation.
That's exactly it.
All right. Well, there is the regulations include a provision on how to do that, a process. 43 CFR 10.11 guides you through that process. And we'll get into that shortly. Know that there's a process forward for that. Okay.
Right.
Now, Claire, too, I understand you're with a different museum and you have a different situation.
I am indeed. I feel like I should have brought like literal different hats to this.
Or masks.
Right, or masks or something. So I am in a different situation over here at Museum 2. We published a notice of inventory completion for culturally affiliated ancestors under our control and thought we were done. We had repatriated those individuals. We thought we were done. And I was going through our collections the other day and realized that we have additional ancestors. And so we need to go through the whole process for them. So.
Right. So as with the other situation, there's a provision in NAGPRA that addresses new discoveries. And that's 43 CFR 10.13, the future applicability rule. And that gives you deadlines by which you are supposed to consult with the tribes and develop an inventory. And we'll go over those deadlines shortly, but it sounds like you need to identify the tribes who may have an interest and then work with them to determine cultural affiliation and then develop your inventory, finalize your inventory. Maybe you provided a draft to them initially. And it may be a culturally affiliated inventory. It may be a culturally unidentifiable inventory. If it's a culturally affiliated inventory, you'll proceed to developing a notice of inventory completion right away. You may do that same thing for the culturally unidentifiable individuals if there are Aboriginal land tribes. And if not, you'll follow a different process that we'll talk about in a bit. And if they're culturally unidentifiable, you maybe want to take an extra step and offer disposition, do something a little bit more than just publishing the notice to facilitate their return. And then you'll transfer control no sooner than 30 days after the notice is published in the Federal Register. But all through that process, you're going to consult with those tribes, right? Until they tell you, we don't want to consult with you anymore. We don't want to hear from you anymore. And at any time during that process, they could request repatriation.
And so based on what I saw when I was looking at the documentation for these ancestors, there are associated funerary objects, and we know the collector, and we know more or less where these ancestors were removed from. So is that enough for me to start moving towards making a cultural affiliation determination?
Right. So 43 CFR 10.14 provides the guidance on how to determine cultural affiliation. And it lists lines of evidence that you may use. And if you only have one line of evidence, that's what you use. And you make that determination of cultural affiliation by having an earlier identifiable group and some evidence, even one line, and making that connection to a modern day tribe or more than one federally recognized tribe. And the level of proof is preponderance. It's what a reasonable person with no expertise would conclude based on the available evidence. And of course, that available evidence should include information provided by tribes during consultation if they choose to provide that evidence. So yeah, you could just have one line of evidence such as geography. But you seem to have associated funerary objects as well. And now maybe, yeah. And so maybe you don't have the expertise to determine cultural affiliation based on the funerary objects, but the tribes may be able to look at, say, their sherds and say, oh, there's shell temper in those sherds. And then the tribes could say, oh, shell temper predates our arrival in that location. And then they would then determine they're maybe not culturally affiliated. You could also have a situation where all the tribes whose Aboriginal homeland includes that location are associated with shell temper, could have had shell temper. Maybe it predates them, but maybe those were at the site and they used them too. And so you could culturally affiliate jointly with multiple tribes who actually have no relationship with each other, but have a relationship to that place and those items.
Okay.
Is Claire 3 arriving now?
I think she might be. And so I, at Museum 3, am in a little bit of a stickier situation, it feels like. So I think we complied with NAGPRA. I found what looked like inventories, but I looked on the National NAGPRA Program's website and we're still listed as having ancestors and associated funerary objects. And I looked at the Federal Register and we definitely haven't published a notice, but I don't have any record of consultation. I just have this inventory. And I'm at a little bit of a loss as to how to make up for lost time because it's dated from like 1998.
So based on the conversations we've had with Claire 1 and Claire 2, what do you think you need to do?
Well, I think the first thing that I should do is reach out to the National NAGPRA program and see if they can share with me a copy of everything that my institution has ever submitted to them. Because sidebar here, Claire 4, who is working for a NAGPRA consultant, knows that the National NAGPRA program has digital copies of everything that's ever been submitted to them by institutions. So if there are gaps in your records, first thing to do is reach out to the National NAGPRA program and get a copy. I also know, back as Claire 3, who has this inventory, that I need to initiate consultation. I need to pick up that dropped ball. And so if I have tribes that I think might have an interest listed on that inventory, that's probably where I want to start. And they might, in consultation, be able to tell me other tribes that are interested, or they might say, nope, we're not interested. So that's where I'd start.
That's
by
great,
reaching
Claire.
out and starting communication again.
That's great, Claire. And in a few slides, we're going to cover how to identify Aboriginal land tribes. Under 10.11, as that term's defined under 10.11, and that would help you identify additional tribes that may have an interest. And there are some trainings available on Aboriginal land that we've recorded. One was just released by the National NAGPRA program that will really come in handy for identifying additional tribes and understanding all the resources to do that. And one of those resources is the Federal Register to look there and see who else has worked in that area, has had ancestors from that area, and what tribes they worked with. It's getting a little trickier nowadays because the new notice template doesn't include a place for all invited tribes to be listed. You're only going to see the culturally affiliated tribes or the Aboriginal land tribes listed in templates or notices based on the current template. So I recommend looking at older notices, slightly older notices. The template switch just occurred within the last year. All right. Claire, do you have any more museums there in your office? Does the dog have any museums that they're representing?
So yes, but they actually submitted a statement of no summary way back in the day. So they don't have anything that would fall under NAGPRA.
No inventory?
No inventory, no summary.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Stella, you're off the hook. All right. So here's that promised slide on disposition of culturally unidentifiable individuals. So after all that work, all of that additional consultation that needed to be done because you didn't consult initially, or you did and it just wasn't to the level that you want it to be, you have 43 CFR 10.11, a process laid out to facilitate the disposition of culturally unidentifiable human remains. It does not require the disposition of the associated funerary objects, but there's a strong urging to include the associated funerary objects with the ancestors. And the reason why the reg couldn't require disposition of the associated funerary objects is because the law is silent on the associated funerary objects in the section where it talks about developing a culturally unidentifiable inventory. It just says you'll describe the human remains. It neglected to say you'll also describe the associated funerary objects, and the regs can't do more than what the law says. That would be stepping into the realm of what Congress does by mandating something that Congress didn't require, because the regs are developed by the Department of Interior. And so it's just a strong recommendation to do that. So there are must provisions and may provisions in this regulation. The must, you must do. The may, it's optional. And so the must provision is that you must, not you, but federal agencies must offer disposition of culturally unidentifiable individuals from tribal lands. And typically that means the Bureau of Indian Affairs must offer disposition of ancestors removed from Indian reservations. Now, museums must offer disposition of culturally unidentifiable individuals from Aboriginal lands. And the regulation includes a definition of Aboriginal lands. It's a broader definition than the definition in the discovery provision. So this is an example of where you shouldn't just search Aboriginal land in the regs and you may land in the discovery provision rather than this provision. You want to make sure you're in this provision when you're trying to understand the process for returning culturally unidentifiable individuals that are in a museum collection. And so we have a little yellow post-it here in this slide that has hyperlinks, and we can share those hyperlinks with you. Claire, maybe we can do that in the chat, do you think?
I can absolutely drop those in the chat.
Okay, so we talked about this with Melanie O'Brien, the National NAGPRA Program Manager, over the course of 2 NAGPRA Community of Practice meetings. Melanie did the first meeting, and then another associate, Jane Richardson, and I did the second meeting. And so those are the first 2 hyperlinks. And then National NAGPRA Program asked us to develop some NAGPRA trainings for their YouTube channel, and those were just launched. And the Aboriginal Land under NAGPRA link will be put in the chat, and you can just go to the NAGPRA Program's YouTube channel and get that too. You can get to that from the program's website, their training tab, or our website has a resource tab where you can find the link if you miss it in the chat. And so best practice is to use all those resources that you gather in that training and from the regs to find your Aboriginal land tribes, consult with them, see if you can make a cultural affiliation determination. If not, proceed with publishing your notice of inventory completion. And we always encourage our clients to send a disposition offer letter out to the Aboriginal land tribes that includes a disposition agreement. And that agreement gives tribes the option to request disposition jointly with the other tribes who also request, or to support disposition, or they could take no action. And that disposition agreement names the tribe who will take physical custody and rebury. And we have found over the years that that really helps the tribes decide if they're comfortable or not with requesting disposition, helps them feel comfortable doing that because they know someone has already stepped up and said they'll take care of those ancestors. Otherwise, they worry that they'll have requested disposition, they'll have control, but maybe they have cultural prohibitions against taking physical custody and reburying, and that would put them in a very difficult situation. So, Claire, I understand you're representing a museum who finds yourself in this sort of situation.
Yes, I think if we go back to Claire 1, all the way back at the beginning, we did submit our culturally unidentifiable inventory before the initial deadline, but we just said that everyone under our control was culturally unidentifiable. And I, as a new employee a couple of years ago, started looking at that inventory and our documentation. And I think that we can probably culturally affiliate some of the individuals under our control. So I want to start that process.
Excellent. So yeah, this regulation actually says to consult, especially if you didn't consult when you were developing that inventory. And you can certainly develop an amended inventory if a cultural affiliation determination can be made. And even if it can't, you'll develop an amended inventory naming those additional tribes with whom you consulted. And it could be that maybe those tribes identified additional funerary objects during that consultation that will be listed in that inventory. Or maybe they asked you to reassess the M&I, the minimum number of individuals, because I'm guessing now that you were like a lot of museums back in the day when everyone was doing their inventories off of the paper record and didn't actually look in the boxes.
We definitely did that.
So your minimum number of individual count may be off. The tribes want you to reassess it because they need to know so they can prepare these individuals for burial. And they want to reconnect those individuals with their funerary objects.
And so that leads me to another question as I start on this process, is that, for a couple of these individuals, we know they're from an archaeological context, and we have all of the excavated material from those projects, and I don't think anybody's ever looked through it. Is that something I should do as part of this process too, as I consult with the tribes?
Absolutely. And so this could be crossover to summary provision compliance as well, because the tribes may be looking for items that are unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, or objects of cultural patrimony. They could also identify associated funerary objects, which would be described in your inventory. But if they find those other items, they could claim those under the repatriation provision as summary items.
Okay.
And you may need to update your summary too, but we'll talk about that in a bit.
We will indeed.
And we'll strategize on how not to make this completely overwhelming now that it's bringing in both collections and summary. So I understand that there's another museum representative there in your green room.
There is. And I actually just got a letter from a tribe, and they want to consult about individuals that are listed on our culturally unidentifiable inventory. And this is the first time I've heard from them. I don't think we've had any action on consultation for these individuals up until this point. And how do I respond?
Well, first of all, was it a request to consult, or was it actually a disposition request for these individuals?
You know, I think it was a disposition request.
Right. So the reg doesn't say what to do if you get a disposition request, other than you must publish a notice of inventory completion within 90 days of receiving a claim for culturally affiliated individuals or culturally affiliated cultural items. But what this reg says is you must start to consult within 90 days of receipt of a request to consult. And so you should consider that disposition request as a request to consult, but you also should consider it as potentially a repatriation request. The tribe may be saying they're culturally affiliated. And if that's the case, you need to consult with them to see what that evidence is of cultural affiliation, so you can amend the inventory. But this regulation says that you must consult within 90 days with all the Aboriginal land tribes. You must initiate that consultation within 90 days with all the Aboriginal land tribes. So again, you need to do those trainings, because we don't have time here today and next week to give you that training on how to identify Aboriginal land tribes, but you need to identify them so you can invite them to consult within the 90 days provided by the reg.
Okay. And here's your Claire as NAGPRA consultant sidebar for this, is that we've shared all of these fabulous resources, but honestly, Wikipedia is a really great starter resource. You know, you can search for a culture, and very often it includes the list of federally recognized tribes who are a part of that culture. So definitely use the Google as a good starting point if you're just feeling a little lost and overwhelmed. We do it all the time. So end of sidebar.
Yes, and we have built our database based on a lot of research, which included Wikipedia.
Yes.
And Google and the tribes and Federal Register notices. And now we feel like we have a pretty comprehensive database containing all the federally recognized tribes and the cultures they're associated with. So that's something we can provide to our clients. And National NAGPRA program used to have something like that on their website, but they took it down. So right now, this reg doesn't have a deadline for offering disposition, but we strongly encourage you to move forward with publishing notices of inventory completion when you have Aboriginal land tribes as expeditiously as possible. engaging in consultation with them before you do that as needed, and offering disposition, doing that extra step of actually sending out a disposition offer to help keep the process moving. So here are the must, here's the must and the may. And the may, we talked about the must, but not the may provisions. And I'm going to cough for a second, sorry. All right. So Claire, I understand that you're with a museum that is in a situation related to the May, one of the May provisions.
I am indeed. So I am with a museum in the Northeast, and most of our collections are local. And what I'm running into is that some of the individuals that we're trying to disposition are from locations where, as far as I can tell, there aren't federally recognized tribes with Aboriginal land. And I don't want these individuals to just stay at my institution. We have really good working relationships with a local non-recognized, local to the area the individuals were removed from, non-federally recognized Indian group, and they're willing to take physical custody and rebury these individuals. Is there a way I can work with them to do that?
So as you can see here, there is a provision for proceeding with disposition to non-recognized tribes, but you must make sure that you have consulted with all of the federally recognized tribes whose Aboriginal homeland includes the location from which they were removed. And so I would just encourage you to confirm that there really are no federally recognized tribes associated with that particular location. And you can do that again through the resources that we've talked about already. And if you are still convinced that there are no federally recognized tribes, which can be the case, there was an example of that recently in Santa Cruz, California, where the museum made the case that there were no federally recognized tribes. It was just the non-recognized tribe that was really culturally affiliated, but they don't have standing under NAGPRA, so they can't be named as a culturally affiliated tribe. Instead, it's a culturally unidentifiable inventory, and you're going to ask the review committee for a recommendation for disposition to that non-recognized group. You're going to have to provide evidence that there are no federally recognized tribes, or if there are federally recognized tribes whose Aboriginal homeland includes that location, you must show that none of them objects to the disposition. And then you should get the recommendation from the review committee. It's a recommendation that they're making to the Secretary of the Interior that the disposition proceed. You'll wait for the Secretary's concurrence, which you'll get through a letter from Melanie O'Brien, the designated federal officer, who's also the manager of the National NAGPRA program. And then at that point, you'll be able to publish a notice of inventory completion in the Federal Register. And then no sooner than 30 days after that notice is published, you can proceed with the disposition to the non-recognized group. It's a very similar situation that you can go through when there are no tribes who feel comfortable requesting, no federally recognized tribes, no non-recognized tribes. You can actually go through that same process with the review committee to get permission to bury under state law. And we did that not too long ago for a client in Texas. Okay. All right. So let's move on and see who's in the green room next. So we're going to move on now from inventory provision to summary provision and repatriation provision. So summaries are done for Native American objects of cultural patrimony, sacred objects, and unassociated funerary objects. and they are always repatriated. They're never dispositioned. They're in that they always go to a culturally affiliated tribe or tribes. Disposition, that word is used when it's a culturally unidentifiable situation. All right. So, Claire, has your museum developed a summary and distributed it to tribes in the National NAGPRA program?
So we haven't. We are starting fresh. We just got federal funds for the first time, and we know there are deadlines for us to comply with since we're now recognized as a museum, and I want to make sure we do it right. So we haven't submitted a summary yet. And I'm looking for guidance on how to do it.
You're right. And again, so it's the future applicability rule, 43 CFR 10.13, that guides the timeline that you have to comply. So as a new museum, you have time. You have a few years, and we'll go over the amount of time in a bit. You have a few years to develop your summaries, and those summaries may be general descriptions of the collection, or they could be itemized lists of what is present. And then you need to determine what tribes may have an interest in those items and distribute that information to those tribes and to the National NAGPRA program. Back in 1993, November 16th, 1993, when those summaries were originally due, they were submitted to the Department of Interior consulting archaeologists. The National NAGPRA program didn't exist at that time. So you may see letters in your files. If you had been a museum back then, that would have been addressed to Frank McManaman. And so then the summary provision not only requires you to develop a summary and distribute it, but it also requires you to invite consultation. And best practice is, and the regs actually say this to a certain extent, that you should follow up that distribution with phone calls to confirm that those were received and to gauge the tribe's level of interest in consulting. And at that time, you may get requests for additional information, for photographs, and you are required by the summary provision to provide that information so long as it's related to the tribe's ability to develop claims. Okay. Is there another museum representative there in the room?
Oh, there certainly is. So my museum, I know that we submitted a summary before the original deadline. I have what I think are some copies of it. It looks like our original summary was a very general description, so general as to my eye, be pretty much unusable. And, I think we submitted it to all of the tribes that that might have an interest, but I don't know. And I've asked National NAGPRA for copies of everything that we sent them. And I'm in the process of looking at that list and making sure that it lines up with everybody who should have received a summary or needs to now. But I'm wondering how to best move forward to make sure that everybody's getting the same information and has the same opportunities now, because the other piece for this is that my museum, we didn't have, obviously it was 1990, we didn't have the kind of robust collections management systems and databases and digital photos that we do now. So how do I go about reinvigorating this summary provision compliance and hopefully consultation?
Great. questions, and it sounds like you have some insights into how to do your needs assessment, to do that reconciliation of the scope of your collection with the distribution list, with the list of federally recognized tribes today, which has expanded from the list of tribes that existed in 1990 and 1993 when the summaries were due. There are more tribes now than there were then. And so don't fret necessarily about the fact that your summary is really general, because the template that was provided by the Department of Interior consulting archaeologist just a few months before the summaries were due was just that. It was a very bare bones, single page document that you were encouraged to provide if you couldn't provide a detailed list. And it basically just talked about, we have 5 baskets from the Southwest. We have 7 ceramic vessels associated with the Pueblo of Acoma. We have 16 sherds from the Southwest. It was supposed to be just like that. And so it's fine that that was your summary, and you don't need to send out a new summary to those summary recipients. What you want to do for those original summary recipients is reinvigorate consultation and information sharing. So if you now have that robust database where you can provide them with a detailed report, or maybe access through a password to your database or an online version of it, then that would be great, because they can go through and they can begin to see if they have an interest in any of the items and would like to consult with you, or maybe move right to claim. And now, more likely than not, there are tribes who didn't receive a summary back in 1993 that should have, because they were federally recognized at the time. And there are tribes who got federal recognition after 1993 who should receive a summary. In that case, you want to develop a new summary for those tribes. And that summary could be a letter, just with that general description of the collection, and then reports attached or access to databases. Things like that. And you want to make sure that all the elements that are supposed to be in a summary according to the regs are in your letter and the attachments. So go through that summary provision regulation to use it as a checklist to make sure you're covering everything in the letter and the enclosures. Okay. Is there another museum representative there, Claire?
Oh, yes. And in this case, I was going through our files. I just took over as our new NAGPRA coordinator, and I found a repatriation claim for some sacred items from a tribe that I don't think the previous coordinator ever acted on. So I know this is kind of like really deep into the process, but how do I move forward with this as my starting point?
Right. So this is yet another example of a way that a museum may have failed to comply with NAGPRA. If you'll remember those 9 ways a museum might fail to comply, one of them is to not publish a notice of intent to repatriate within 90 days of receipt of a valid repatriation claim. And so you want to start that process with the tribes, give them a call, tell them you found that claim, ask them if they would like you to proceed with notice of intent to repatriate publication. And if they would like you to do that, do so. But of course,
Right.
First you'll want to take a look at that claim and make sure it's a valid claim. And 43 CFR 10.10 in the regulations tells you how to determine if a claim is valid. Right? It's from a federally recognized tribe, a tribe withstanding, or a lineal descendant, or a Native Hawaiian organization. And a lineal descendant is described in 43 CFR 10.14. they're culturally affiliated with what is being claimed, and what is being claimed must be covered by one of the NAGPRA definitions. It must meet the definition of sacred object, object of cultural patrimony, or unassociated funerary object. Okay.
And so since it seems pretty clear to me that this is a valid claim, it's a federally recognized tribe, they demonstrate cultural affiliation, and it's very clearly for an item that meets the definition of sacred object. So I want to move forward. So I reach out and I tell the tribes that and share a draft notice of the intent to repatriate with them. And then I'm ready to submit that to National NAGPRA for publication.
Yes, and you will make their day.
Okay.
Yes, we did that for a client in Oklahoma. We were there to do a needs assessment, found the claim in the files, and brought it to the director of the museum. She called the tribe and told him that they were going to move forward with publication. And he was shocked and delighted. Yes. And he's not going to turn around and make an allegation of non-compliance against you. He would have done that 15 years ago when he submitted the claim, or any time in between then. But he waited patiently for that museum to revisit the claim. Thanks to new staff, that was done. Shall we move on, Claire? Or do you have another museum person?
Okay. I think I'm running out of alternate personalities.
We're gonna make you have a spinning head. All right. The future applicability rule. Would you like me to do this one, Claire?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the future applicability rule is found at 43 CFR 10.13 in the regulations. And it provides those timelines that I mentioned earlier for different scenarios. So if you have a new holding or collection, a new acquisition, you are supposed to submit a summary describing that item or items or ancestors, we're talking summary provision, not ancestors, cultural item, such as sacred object, object of cultural patrimony, or unassociated funerary object. And you shouldn't be cherry picking what meets those definitions. We recommend you report every Native American item that you acquire that wasn't made, for the art market today. And so you have a requirement to report that in a summary within 6 months of acquisition to the tribes who may have an interest, or Native Hawaiian organizations who may have an interest, and you submit that to the National NAGPRA program. Also, they will then add that tribe to their summary database as a recipient of your summary. And you have 2 years to develop an inventory in consultation with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations for human remains and associated funerary objects, and get those inventories and notices of inventory completion to the National NAGPRA program. And if they're culturally affiliated inventories, they need to be submitted to the tribes as well. And if you have additional pieces or fragments of previously reported items, they would be included in the original descriptions. You don't need to report additional findings, but it may be appropriate to let the tribes who received your summary know of these additional findings. And if their ancestors that have been previously reported and returned, then you'd certainly need to let them know. And I may have misspoke a little bit here. So these are reported and returned. That means they've already been described in notices, and transfer of control has already occurred. So that means the additional pieces that you find, additional elements of a person, additional pieces of a maybe a quiver and bow set, those are already in the control of the tribe or tribes to whom you transferred after the notice was published. So you let them know that they're here and make arrangements for them to take physical custody. If there's a new tribe who just received federal recognition, you have 6 months to submit a summary to them, and you have 2 years to develop and submit an inventory. And you need to be developing that inventory in consultation with the newly recognized tribe. This happened in a huge way a few years ago when 7 tribes were recognized in Virginia all at one time. So new federal funds. I think one of Claire's earliest scenarios was an institution that received federal funds for the very first time. And I promised to let you know how long they had to comply. They have 3 years to do the summary and 5 years to do the inventories. And those were the original deadlines established in NAGPRA for museums to comply. And that's why the summaries were due in 1993 and the cultural affiliation determinations were due in 1995. So prior to transfer of control, notices may be amended. You may have gone all the way down the road with a notice of inventory completion publication, but the tribe never requested repatriation. You never transferred control to the tribe or tribes. It could be that you find additional funerary objects from that same site and you realize they are associated with these ancestors. You would want to do an amended inventory to describe those additional funerary objects. Or you've gone through the faunal material at the request of the tribes and the whole archaeological site collection, and you discover additional individuals among the faunal material and additional associated funerary objects, then you would go back and amend your notice of inventory completion. Typically, notices of intent to repatriate for sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and unassociated funerary objects go through the process very quickly. And as soon as the 30-day post-publication waiting period's over, you transfer control. And so you wouldn't go back typically and amend a notice of intent to repatriate. But there may be certain situations where that happens as well. Claire?
I think you're up first, Jan.
Strategic planning. So here we are. You've done your needs assessment, and now you need to figure out how to approach this. It may feel incredibly overwhelming. You may have hundreds of individuals or thousands of individuals from hundreds of sites, not only in your state, but in states across the country. You may also have a significant number of items that could be covered by the summary provision. And so this is an example. This is like a little teeny tiny sliver of a spreadsheet. It's actually a workbook. It's one worksheet in a big workbook that we developed for one of our clients. And it was a large state university. And they had done they'd done paper-based inventories, describing the human remains and associated funerary objects. They'd submitted a certain number of summaries to a limited number of tribes in compliance with the original deadlines. And they had a disposition request for all of the culturally unidentifiable ancestors in their control and possession, dating back 11 years. And the tribes in their state finally convinced the administration of this university that they needed to consult with the tribes and proceed with the disposition of the culturally unidentifiable individuals. So the university brought us in to do the needs assessment and to identify cases. What we do is when we're faced with these large numbers of individuals from many locations, is we do that Aboriginal land research to look for counties that share a unique set of Aboriginal land tribes. And that becomes a NAGPRA implementation case. And then we present our research to all the tribes who may have an interest. In this case, it's Michigan. We presented our research to the Michigan tribes and to see if they agreed with this assessment, or if maybe they had additional information that would change this assessment. In this case, one tribe shared a migration map with us that changed everything, and for 3 tribes. And so we reevaluated, reassessed with the tribes, came up with the final list of cases, and then talked with them about, do you want to proceed with culturally unidentifiable through 10.11, or would you like to culturally affiliate based on geography? Because you do have that, at least that one line of evidence, if not more. Some of these are archaeological sites. And in this case, the tribes all agreed that they wanted to proceed with disposition under 10.11. And that was for very private intertribal reasons that they didn't share fully with the client or us. And so that's how we proceeded state by state. In some cases, ancestors became known because we encouraged the client to send out a questionnaire to all departments, asking if anyone had Native American or any human remains or Native American cultural items. We didn't ask if they were Native American human remains, we just asked if they had human remains, to see if additional ancestors may be somewhere on campus or cultural items that should be reported. And someone had a Navajo individual. And so that was a situation where we didn't use Aboriginal land. We had an earlier identifiable culture, Navajo. We have the Navajo Nation that was culturally affiliatable. Let the Navajo Nation know of this, see if they object to proceeding with notice publication. And so all this was done for this client in 2.5 years. We facilitated the return of hundreds of ancestors and associated funerary objects and unassociated funerary objects, but it was only because the tribes in Michigan met with this client monthly to push the project along, that the administration at the university was behind this 100% with funding, and otherwise it can take a lot longer. But it was my team, it was one administrator, one NAGPRA coordinator at the campus, and the tribes that got this done. Claire, do you want to talk about this one?
I would love to. And so, when you think about the previous example where, this is a large institution, they have pretty solid intellectual control over what's in their control. They have a database that shows what they know about each individual or each location. And so that was our starting point when we were supporting that client, is that, that let us do that Aboriginal territory research. But, you might be starting in a very different place. And so I actually spent a couple of weeks last summer on site supporting a small public library. They just found out that they actually have control of a collection of Native American cultural items. This came as a little bit of a surprise to them, being they thought they were just responsible for books. And so they didn't know anything about this collection. And so we actually started from absolute ground level, and we went through item by item to, give them that intellectual control that would let them determine who should receive a summary. And so this meant that we looked at, some of these items were actually marked with where they were from. So we compiled all of that information and ended up with a list of states and sometimes counties where these items had come from. And so from that, we were then sort of at that same point where we were with the large university. But remember, this is summary provision, so it's a little bit different. But this gave us that list of tribes who might have an interest and who should receive the summary. And like we talked about before in one of my various personas, their summary took the form of a letter that included a general description of the collection, who the donor was, how he acquired this material, and sort of all of those things that you need to hit for it to be considered a summary under the law and regs. And then we also shared this comprehensive list as an attachment. And so, this was a very different situation. They only had, they have about 1,200 items under their control. And so they went from the realization that they needed to comply with NAGPRA and that was about this time last year, to consultations in December, to their first repatriation, the transfer of legal control for some unassociated funerary objects a couple of months ago. So, it doesn't have to be big and scary. Just start from where you are.
So this is an example of a large art museum we're currently working with, and this is intentionally impossible for you to read because it is such a massive amount of data that has been provided here. And so what this is actually showing is the needs assessment that we did for the summary provision. And we didn't know that we were going to go down that road this soon. We thought we were going to be providing this client with support to develop an inventories describing ancestors found by the curator who came on board in 2019. She, as part of her initial work, wanted to go through everything in the entire collection under her purview to see what their NAGPRA situation actually was compared to what they thought it was. And as a part of that process, she discovered human remains in the collection. She reached out to an osteologist who she knew was trusted by the tribes in her state. And that osteologist determined that all of the individuals are Native American. And then she reached out to us to help her facilitate inventory development and disposition of those individuals. And we wrote letters for this client to send to the tribes, inviting them to consult about those ancestors. And the first thing those tribes said is, we have been trying to see your collection for decades, and we haven't really had great luck seeing the cultural collections or getting access to the records. And so we want to talk about that first before we talk about development of inventories for these individuals. And so this workbook that you're seeing on the screen, a page from the workbook, is a list of all the summary recipients on the National NAGPRA Programs database, combined with all the summary letters that the client had on file. There was some misalignment in those two lists, and then a list of all the tribes in the country who may have an interest in this art museum's collection. And so we've identified, as we talked about earlier, the tribes who already received a summary, who don't need a new one. They just need additional information about the collections. A list of tribes who never received the summary that should have. And then that includes the tribes who were federally recognized after the summary provision. The summaries were due. And so we started off with conversations with the tribes with an interest in Michigan, the location of this art museum, but now these summaries need to be distributed widely to all the tribes who may have an interest. So what I take away from this is that you can have a plan, and you should have a plan to guide you, but you also need to be responsive to the tribes and the Hawaiian organizations and their needs, and while keeping your eye on those deadlines that you have to stay in compliance with NAGPRA. And Claire, that actually reminds me of another client who found themselves in this situation. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So another one of our clients, we had just finished helping them with their strategic plan, and the way that it was looking was like they would have probably about 10 years of NAGPRA work. And the wonderful thing about having a strategic plan in place is that each sort of case or each work unit can make a really good NAGPRA grant project. But, we had pretty much just handed this off to them. They were ready to implement, and they got a letter from a tribe that was following up on, it was an earlier repatriation request, right, Jan, that they hadn't ever heard back from. And
I think it was the tribe
totally
sending letters
changed.
out. Yeah, I think it was the tribe sending letters out nationally for all the culturally unidentifiable individuals in their area of interest. So they got caught up in that letter distribution.
Yep. Thank you. And so, this particular set of ancestors, they were year 7 in the plan. And so since our client had received this letter, it was well, hang on, like, there's no reason we can't start with them. This was just an arbitrary, workflow, but let's respond to this. Let's work with the tribes. And they did. And it started them off on this fabulous relationship. And it really set the groundwork for them in a way that I don't think they had expected, but worked out very well. And so now I know the moment that you've all been waiting for, your assignment for next week. And we promise this isn't going to be painful. None of this is make work. This is all setting you up for success. So for each institution here, we would like a brief, absolutely no more than 4 minutes, 3 is just fine, presentation that's going to cover the results of your needs assessment that you're going to get started on this week. And then also bring 2 burning questions related to your strategic plan and things that you need to know to move forward. And so our goal for the next time we're all together is that each institution will present and share your questions, and then we'll compile all those questions. And once you've all had a chance to present, we'll sort of look at all those questions together, because we sort of imagine there might be some similar questions, and we don't want you to have to reinvent the wheel. So hoping to do this all together. And then, Jan, if you can take us to the next slide, because I know we've talked about a bunch of places that you can go to start finding all this information that will help you assess where you are in your NAGPRA compliance journey. And so the first place to start is probably right on your laptop right now. What does your institution have? Do you have NAGPRA files stashed somewhere that you can peruse and look at? What does your collections management and registration files tell you? Do you have catalog records for the ancestors under your control that say where they're from or who collected them? All of that information will help inform your strategic plan and needs assessment. And also, legal departments very often get roped into this process, and they might have some files for you to look at. Institutional archives, maybe you have a practice of moving everything to archives after 5 years. And the same for cold storage. Who knows what you might find, given, a lot of this was happening in the early 90s, and it's quite likely that you don't have ready access to those files now. And also, as we said, reach out to National NAGPRA and request a copy of everything your institution has submitted. They've been turning those requests around very quickly lately. So it's possible that if you reached out today or tomorrow, you might actually get those back before next week. And then again, take a look at their online databases. Once you find your institution's name, you can actually see if you've submitted summaries, who those summaries were submitted to, and the same for inventories. Do you have individuals who are still listed in National NAGPRA's databases who haven't been repatriated? And also, if you're interested, because National NAGPRA doesn't have all of the inventory information readily accessible online, if that would be beneficial to you as you're doing this research, when you reach out to National NAGPRA to ask for copies of your submissions, you can also ask for a copy of the detailed version of the inventory database. And then also, take a look at the Federal Register. Do a search for your institution's name and NAGPRA and notice, and it will return any notices that your institution is mentioned in. And once you sort of start pulling all of that together and wrapping your head around it, you'll probably start getting a sense for where you are in this process. And we'll start from there next week. I know we have a couple of minutes, so if anyone does have any questions, we are happy to take those now. I know we've also given you a ton of information, so it's quite all right if you're all feeling a touch overwhelmed right now too and don't have questions.
And also feel free to drop any questions they want into the chat if that's easier too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just put those resources in the chat so you can have them.
And it looks like, I would say it looks like we have Kate who's saying, thank you for the wonderful presentation.
And Jan, who should they be reaching out to specifically at National NAGPRA if they want to request copies?
I always send that request to Mariah Soriano, but they don't actually publicize individual people's email addresses. So you can send it to the general info email. And Claire, are you pulling that one up?
I am.
You can put it in the chat. Thank you. The response will be from Mariah Soriano, and then you'll have her email address. And if you haven't taken a good look at the National NAGPRA Program's website lately, the database hyperlinks are down at the bottom of the home page. They're pictures. And there's an inventory database, a summary database, and a Federal Register notice database. And once your inventory, the ancestors described in your inventory are described in a notice, once they're published in a notice, your inventory listing for those individuals is removed from the inventory database. It didn't used to be like that, but now the inventories listed in the inventory database are only those for those individuals and associated funerary objects that have not yet been described in a notice of inventory completion. And the Federal Register database lists notices of inventory completion and notices of intent to repatriate.
And it looks like we have a question from Kate about what to include in the presentation. If it's just their findings from emailing National NAGPRA plus next steps with the process. Yeah, you know, wherever you find yourself, if your realization is that you haven't done anything, you know, start gathering what information you have internally that would help you figure out, you know, is it inventory or summary? Is it both? What tribes might you need to be contacting? That kind of information so that you can start thinking strategically about what outreach you need to do. Does that help? Okay.
And by our count on the registration list, as it stood yesterday, there are 14 institutions present, or 14 institutions registered, and then there is one consulting firm here. And so I don't know that the consulting firm is going to have a needs assessment and presentation or not. I think there you are.
Yeah, hi. So I was kind of
Hi.
brainstorming how I wanted to handle that. I am working with a museum right now, but they don't have any human remains, so that's kind of funky. But I was considering examining another local institution and role playing from that angle, if that's fine.
Yeah, if you'd like to do that, just to practice the process, absolutely. So it looks like 15 institutions. So I know there are some of you here from the same, like multiple people from the same institution, so you can designate your presenter or you can tag team it like Claire and I did. Any other questions, concerns? Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the workshop, and thank you to Nima for hosting this.
Oh, it's been our pleasure. Thank you so much, Jan and Claire, for such an informative presentation. This has been wonderful. And thank you to everybody who spent the past hour and a half with us learning about NAGPRA. We'll be meeting again next week. So we'll see you in a week. I'll send out a reminder email to everybody with a link next Wednesday, just to bring it to the top of your inbox. And I believe somebody had asked, this session was recorded. So it was recorded to the cloud. So you should receive a link for it to access the recording later this afternoon. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and we'll see you in a week. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Take care.
Bye, Jenna. Thanks.
Yeah, it was so lovely. I'll see you next week. And if anybody sends me any questions, I'll forward them your way.
Okay,
Perfect.
sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. Yep. Take care.